This is House Planning Help, episode 342. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is architect Kirsty Maguire. It's been a while. I'm looking forward to catching up with her. We're discussing reuse as well. Is it just another environmental aspiration, or can we work it into our project? We probably should. How do we do it well? How does all this work? We will discuss. Before we launch into our interview, I wanted to mention the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. It's a great organisation, but the reason I thought I'd bring it up here is because they have this Reuse Now campaign. Obviously, they're all about using great materials in your builds. They have the awards that we've talked about in the past, and they've even held the Reuse Summit. So another source to go and have a look at. We're always trying to promote people who are doing good work. So that's the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And we'll work in a link into today's show notes. So let's get to our featured interview with architect Kirsty Maguire, looking at circular economy and reuse. And with so many aspects of green building to consider, we're always talking about performance, low embodied carbon materials, and now reuse. So I wanted to know when this first came on her radar.
Yeah, so sustainability has to start with reuse, really. And a lot of our projects are new build. There's lots of good reasons for doing new build. But working with existing buildings, it's exciting, it's challenging, but it's also essential because, of course, most of our buildings already exist. Because there's so many materials involved in a building that if they can stay where they are and be reused, then that is the best option. But where buildings can't be reused, then reclaiming materials from them and reusing them is fantastic and a really exciting opportunity, I think, for us as designers. So we've done everything from little cottage upgrades to working with the UNDP in Armenia doing big tower block retrofits. And that's really, that's what's going to change the world in the short time, I suppose you could say.
And how practical is that, reusing materials from buildings?
It depends on the material and it depends on the context. So unfortunately, it's never quite as simple as just going and buying something from the builder's merchant. But there's a huge amount of opportunity for reuse. And it's really about identifying what can be reused from a particular building and then how that might be reused in the project that you're looking at.
And what do we mean by reuse? Because I'm imagining when we take a building material, it may not be doing the same role next time.
Yes, often it's not doing the same role. And again, that's what's creatively really exciting about the process. So usually you end up with things which don't require, for example, a structural input, although there are times when that is possible. So an example would be reusing finishes is often quite straightforward if the quality is sufficient, or you might be using a material in a slightly downgraded structural situation. It all links into circular economy.
And maybe that's actually a good thing to say. What are we talking about when we say the circular economy?
So circular economy is looking at materials not only in the use that they are now, but also beyond that use and into their next life.
Let's bring up our example then, the seed. Tell us about the seed.
So the seed is a new house which has been built just outside Dundee in a woodland garden. It's a home for two families which has shared living, and it's really like a sort of small scale co-housing.
What was it like to begin with this site? How did you come into dealing with this project?
So it's a really beautiful site. There's a lot of mature trees, and there was a house on the site which was built in the late 70s, early 80s. When our client bought it and came to us to do initially an Enofit project was the brief. And we had a look at it in a lot of detail. So we developed a brief with them in terms of the accommodation that they wanted. And that required quite a significant amount of change to the building. But we also looked at the condition of the building to see what was salvageable, what wasn't, what the upgrades would need to be. and how we might progress to bring those two together. Because it certainly wasn't in our minds initially that the building wasn't going to be suitable for reuse, because our approach would always be to reuse rather than recycle, which ultimately is what we did, although that's a really good next step. But the condition of the building was really poor. It was very damp, very cold. Most of the building fabric was at the end of its life, and anything that we could possibly have retained in its existing situation, i.e., within a building, there was very little of it, and it didn't actually suit what the client wanted either.
And did you analyse it for what might be available to reuse as a building, or was it just in such poor state, virtually nothing would be available?
Yeah, so we did a big in-depth analysis. So we looked, well, initially we used the existing building itself, and we actually did a whole series of drawings looking at what could be retained, both in terms of the condition of what was there and what was going to have to be taken away and reused either on the site or elsewhere. I suppose that would be a standard recycling, if you like, so it goes to slightly lower grade usage. And then we also plotted all the proposed changes that the client wanted on those drawings as well. And ultimately, we drew the things that were going to have to be taken out in red, and the drawings were almost entirely red. There was very little left. But the primary driver for it was that the building was in terrible condition, unfortunately.
Can you just give us some examples of the materials that we're talking about that have got a life to live on, and how you know that they are durable from this project?
So the building that used to be there was a single skin brick building. And so that was a great opportunity actually, because we took down, when the building was taken down, the bricks stayed on site and were cleaned and then reused back in the building, the new building. And of course, some of those came out and were in a great shape, and some of them were broken in the process. So they were put to different uses. So in some of them, well, we've got gabions, which are part of the foundation structure, and the existing brickwork was used significantly there. The most beautiful gabions I've ever seen, although you have to be pretty tenacious to actually get to see them because they're mostly hidden underneath the new building. And then some of the brickwork that was then broken as part of that process, that was used under the building as aggregate and also within the garden for the biodiversity growing that the client is developing. Because the building itself, the new building, after we just decided that the building was going to have to be taken down and a new one built, the client was keen that there was little or no cement used in the build. So that was a very strong part of the brief that she was particularly keen on. And so that led us down a very interesting route as well, because we were looking then at embodied carbon and embodied energy in the construction, which we would usually do in any case in all our projects. But in this case, again, we had the opportunity to look at that in more detail. And we looked at a whole range of foundation types. And what we ended up with was screw piles, so using steel. And underneath the building, yeah, we had the reused bricks.
It might be worth us actually just rewinding a step. What else was on this brief? It was obviously always going to be a very ecological building, but just so we can get the full understanding of what's going on here, I might come back to those foundations in a minute.
Yeah, so the client was keen to create a home which had shared space, and it's for two families to live together. In a way, you could think of it as a small co-housing project for just two families. So there was a lot of time spent looking at what shared living means, how to create that involvement with each other, but also preserve privacy and agree how that's managed. So ultimately, the brief became two living spaces. So there's a kitchen, living, dining space for each of the two families. But the rest of the house, you might say, is much more conventional in that it has a series of bedrooms upstairs. It's also got a shared office space that they all use. The other big thing about this project is that it's very much a garden which happens to have a house in it. So it has this beautiful woodland garden that's also used related to social elements. So there's a homeschooling group that use the space. It's being used to grow food. That's primarily for the occupants, but also people, for example, who pass by are invited to pick from the hedgerow for food as well. So there's a very interesting social side to this project. And then the client was really keen on an in-depth ecological approach to it. So consideration of all the materials to reduce embodied carbon and embodied energy, and also to create a really comfortable home as well. So it's a passive house, low energy building. And we also looked at overheating in quite a significant detail as well, because the client was particularly keen to avoid temperatures even up to 25 degrees is not something that she wanted. So we looked at that in detail to make sure that the building is comfortable now and in the future as well with climate change.
So Caroline, if I'm right, is the client. And how did that relationship work with the other people that were going to be living in this almost co-housing situation?
So she brought in different people during the process who were all had really useful impact on the design process. Ultimately, she's our client, so it was her decision when it came down to it, simply because the construction process, of course, requires that. But I think what's really interesting is that she did bring in the opinions of all these other people very strongly through that process, and that continues now that they've moved in. It's very important that all the voices of the people who are there are part of the discussion.
Okay, so we know that we've come to the conclusion that the building was not something that was salvageable. We've taken what we can use from that building. What is the next step in terms of reusing? Is there any more that we can reuse from somewhere that's not on site or from some of the timber?
If you imagine the build up of the building, then of course the walls primarily are brick, but they also had some slate tiles. Those were removed and reused in the garden. Most of the timber was taken off site, but some of it stayed on site. And again, she's reusing that herself for some of her garden projects. And likewise, the windows, actually, which were single glazed metal framed windows. And again, they've found a new home. The other thing that's actually interesting, I should say, is that the client works with a company in Dundee, Scrap Antics. So they will repurpose a lot of materials themselves as well. So for people who are looking at this, that's a great resource to look at.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you, that when we come to reuse, let's say we were now dealing with a greenfield that we're building something new on, is there any database yet of other people taking down their buildings that we can tap into, or is it all very much still taking shape?
I'm not aware of an overall database of people doing downtakings, but there are architectural salvage yards who are fantastic places to speak to, and you can spend many a happy hour wandering around. I have done so and no doubt will do so again. It's also great to go to places like stone yards. They often have reclaimed stone, and they might have something that's been sitting in the back there for years and years or even decades, which is exactly what you need for your project. So there are a lot of places you can go. There's a lot of web resources in terms of the architectural salvage as well. And actually, eBay is a great place, Gumtree, any of these online sales places, but it's a bit hit and miss. But there is an industry about architectural salvage, and that pops up all over the country. So it's alive and well for sure.
So are you going in there knowing what you want, or are you browsing?
I think you've got to do a bit of both. So, for example, in another project, we reused the floor from a gym. So it's this beautiful beach floor. Actually, it arrives, and of course, it's all got the little colours on it from the lines from the badminton court or football pitch, indoor football pitch. So that has a really beautiful history, and that's shown on the materials. So sometimes you want to see that, and sometimes people don't want to see the history of it. But generally, when people are reusing materials, it's really nice to know what its previous life has been.
And are we really thinking in general about using these items for finishes for example, you want to build a passive house, and I know that there's quite a lot that goes into that process just to make it work. I know you've been through it many times before, as we've already said, but how are we feeling in terms of reuse? Where does it fit in the new build that we're now creating?
I mean, the easiest part of it is finishes because then we don't need to prove, for example, structural qualities. It's more variable. We don't have manufacturer's data. But in the example of the seed where we were reusing bricks, that was in gabions, which has, I guess you could say, it has a lower grade structural requirement. But other things which are easy to do, reuse of a bath, for example. So again, in this case, the bath has been taken out and reused elsewhere in the project. And in other projects, we've used reclaimed sinks or taps, things like that. So yes, finishes is relatively straightforward to use. It'd be very difficult to potentially reuse insulation because you wouldn't know what its performance is or its fire performance.
Exactly. Yes. I've seen a kitchen that has been put in, and I wouldn't have known it was a reused kitchen. But how would something like that, how would you make that work? Because I imagine I could find some old kitchen, but when you come to put it into the property, it would look a complete mess.
That really comes down to the skill of the people who are putting it in, I would say. So, in one instance, a client found a really great quality kitchen that someone had taken out and they put it into their refurbishment, and it looked absolutely fantastic. You wouldn't know at all. I think that partly comes down to the design of the kitchen. I mean, kitchens are modular. As long as it's reasonably well looked after kitchen, then each of the units can come out individually, be moved around in a different configuration. It's a bit like playing Jenga, I guess.
But also making it look stylish. I wonder whether that's almost an added layer. Yes, the kitchen will look like this, but sometimes, yeah, there's just some little tweaks that make it feel like it deserves to be here.
Yeah, I mean, partly that will depend on what kind of kitchen you're reusing, but also the quality of the installation and any little design additions that you want to add, which may or may not be new or they might be reused from something else. So it might be, for example, not necessarily reuse, but say a client creates a stained glass window, then that might be used within the overall kitchen or other part of the house, despite the fact it's not what we might call a standard construction product. Those little touches can make a massive difference.
Are there any particular reuse aspects that you have been proud of?
I think this project at the Seed has been particularly interesting for us because of the depth of commitment that the client has to overall sustainability and environmental responsibility. So it's not only looking at one thing as part of it, it runs in real depth all the way through the project, whether that's using recycled whiskey barrels for water, which on its own is a nice thing to do. But if we weren't looking at all the rest of it, would be very light touch. But because she's looking at everything from start to finish in this level of depth and really very considered project at all levels, the social, the environmental, that's what I think makes it really interesting and I guess what's something that we can be proud of and I hope she is too.
In terms of time or money, are things different? Are you spending longer analyzing, deconstructing the initial building, thinking where pieces are going? And then on the flip side, is that then being put down as a cost because you've spent that time?
There is inevitably more time to it. And so unfortunately that does equal cost. But I think that's where some of these online resources are really helpful. So let's say we went to one of the online architectural salvage companies. If they can provide us with, let's say, a sink quite easily, then that cuts down time. Whereas if we have to go to, I don't know, I'm not a car boot sale, but that kind of equivalent where you're really raking through things ourselves, then of course that's extremely time consuming. Analyzing and taking down the existing house, that's a process. It does take more time than just starting with a blank sheet of paper and not bothering about any of those things. But the richness in it is well worth it, as well as the environmental impact of reducing waste to landfill. But sadly, our construction industry, of course, is designed to just go straight to the merchant to buy what we've always bought over the last how many years. That's how efficiency works. There's nothing wrong in that, I suppose, but it doesn't take into account the rich wealth of recycled materials that exist out there.
And when you got someone to take down the building, how did that go? Were they nice and gentle? And because that's going to take a little bit of extra time for them.
I'm not sure demolition could ever be described as gentle. It's a fairly brutal affair. But yeah, I mean, demolition companies are incentivized in any case to separate waste and to avoid putting everything into landfill without separating it out. There's also specialist elements like asbestos removal, which have to be done separately in any case. So, as an industry, we've already moved on from the times where you just came with a wrecking ball and everything went into the same skip. As a matter of course, it will be separated, but it's really where that goes from there, whether it goes off for someone else to deal with it, whether, like in this case, we had the space and the time and the opportunity to actually reuse a large proportion of it.
And when we're thinking about waste, what was thrown away? Asbestos, I imagine, carefully, obviously, but that's something that was taken out. Or were you just putting everything on site thinking, well, there must be a use for this somewhere?
Yeah, obviously asbestos was taken by a specialist. Quite a lot of the timber was removed and taken off site, and the plaster, but not much else.
Very good. Let's talk about the design of the house next. So you've mentioned that it's quite unusual because there are going to be shared resources going on. What else informed the design that you have?
Really, the woodland that surrounds the building and the environmental performance. So, the building itself, if you can imagine like a two-story house-shaped house, and then at the back there's a single-story house-shaped house and a little link building in between. Most of the living is in the two-story house. That's where the two kitchen, living, dining areas are, and they face south, which is where the main garden is. So we're looking at optimizing solar gain, making sure that there's loads of light and a really wonderful connection to the garden. So you can come in and out of the house onto decking and then into the garden in a number of places. And when you're inside the house, the shared spaces are timber clad on the walls as well as on the floor. They're very, as the client described it, almost womb-like, very enveloping and warm and cozy, not only from a thermal performance point of view, but from a sort of emotional point of view. And then the two halves of the house are split. Caroline's part of the house and her family, that is a sort of warm brown clay plaster. And then on the other side, it's off-white. That differentiates things a bit, and really that comes down to what the client was really keen to achieve in terms of a warm or visually warm, bright space that is also enveloping.
Let's go back to the foundations now. So screw piles, I understand probably they could be reused at a later date. Is that part of the thinking? But is there any other consideration? Is there perhaps a tree route that you're trying to avoid, or was it really the concrete, the main motivation for moving towards screw piles?
A lot of it was avoiding cement in the process, but it also works very well with the root protection. So some of the areas around the trees, for example, had to be hand dug very carefully. But of course, the building is located, so that was minimized. But inevitably, we need to run services, for example, through that as well. But yes, the steel screw piles, even if they can't be reused, they can be recycled. And this comes back down to the thinking about the whole building life. So in the same way that we were looking at the previous building that was on the site that was at its end of life, and identifying the type of materials that we can reuse within that, despite the fact that when it was built, that wasn't what was being considered. What we're looking at with the new building is how that building could be taken apart at the end of its life, which is not going to be anytime soon. But ultimately, we expect that at some point in the distant future, it will also come to the end of its life. So yes, steel screw piles can be taken out with relatively small impact on the ground. And considering other materials as we go through as to what can be reused and recycled when it does come to that point.
And we've talked about embodied carbon and analysing all of this. So does the steel screw pile foundation have a significant embodied carbon when thinking about the whole of the new building?
I don't yet know the answer to that question because we are looking at getting the full project reviewed. We did do embodied carbon study on the foundation design, and we looked at a range of different options and balanced the structural performance with the embodied carbon as well as the root protection, as you already mentioned. So that's something we looked at in detail as part of the design process. We've looked at embodied carbon with a very similar build-up of the superstructure in the past. And in that case, what was surprising at the time, and we now know is not unusual, is that actually the renewable energy devices were a significant part of the overall embodied carbon. So the actual building itself was reduced to a point where the services became very significant, in particular PV. So PV is great, but like everything, it's not the panacea. So it's using it where appropriate.
I've heard this before, actually. I think it was a topic of discussion at the AECB conference that where you source your solar PV has a big impact on the carbon. So, yeah, there's a lesson there. It gets a bit easier above ground, I guess. That is the other thing. So, how are you going to build the house?
It's certainly easier above the ground in terms of relatively easily available products. So in this case, it was the main contractor is a company called Alpha Projects, who are based in Dundee. And we used an offsite manufactured timber kit, which is by Eden Insulation. That's an I-joist structure with wood fiber insulation and cellulose recycled paper insulation. And that is for the floor, the walls, and the roof.
And what comes next then?
Well, I guess just thinking about managing waste during the build itself. So one of the big areas of potential waste actually was the root protection for the trees, and there's a lot of gravel involved in that process. So again, that was reused on site primarily, and then actually the remainder of it was reused in one of our other buildings. The other advantage actually of the root protection is that it protects the soil, so the soil doesn't get the same extent of damage during the construction period.
You've mentioned about root protection a couple of times. Is this you doing the root protection, or is this part of a planning reason for root protection?
The client would have been keen to do this in any case because of the trees, but it is also a planning requirement. And we worked with Fife Landscaping, who are the specialists who talked us through and educated us a lot about that and how to do it. But it was really interesting because actually the contractor again commented that they really loved having the root protection down because it meant that the site was very clean. It didn't get a lot of mud constantly everywhere, and you're not wading around in the wintertime with mud up to your ankles, and then all the implications of that being tracked through the whole building site.
Now, it's a beautiful house, but is there anything to learn from how it was finished internally?
I think in terms of how the client is now living in it, I think what's interesting is that people who build a new house, for lots of good reasons, will often buy new furniture, and that can work extremely well. But in this case, the client has made sure that she's reusing furniture from elsewhere, buying secondhand, etc. So she's not creating more landfill waste either. So the ethos that she has taken through the build is also being continued in furnishing the house to the extent actually where the platform that she's created in the sitting room area and her part of it, I believe, comes from the sailing club in Broughty Ferry from a long time ago. And actually, one of the joiners on the site, so the site manager, actually worked on those specific items quite a significant time before. So it's really interesting. So unexpectedly, these little stories start to come up and get created about the building too.
And how has everyone enjoyed it? Has it worked as planned when an idea?
Yes, and I think what the client is really delighted about how it works in terms of the social sharing space. And she really says it's gone better than anticipated and how much she feels connected to the garden and the trees. And she also has commented on how comfortable it is with no drafts and being just the right temperature. So really delighted about that.
Are there any lessons for you as a practice having gone through this project?
There's always lessons from every project, I would say, and that's what makes life interesting. I think for us, this is really just an extension of our own ethos as well. We may or may not go into as much depth in all our projects, but the key is that we're thinking about these same strands of consideration at all times. And sometimes clients are particularly keen to source and reuse materials, other times they're not. And there's good reasons for both of those approaches. But we're also thinking about performance, thermal performance, creating spaces that clients love to be in. One of the other things that I think was interesting about this, which you haven't mentioned, that runs through a lot of our projects is biodiversity and ecology. And a lot of our sites are either suburban or rural sites. And in this particular case, and this is a risk with downtakings and demolitions, is actually bats. So in this case, when the contractor was taking down the project, they found a bat. So immediately, of course, they stopped work and the ecologists came round and assessed the situation. And it turned out there was just one bat, and the bat was happily rehoused adjacent. But these are things to be thought about in any kind of retrofit project or demolition. What's existing there already, it's not just the humans. There's a lot of other things going on who keep the house as their home.
Now, let's say someone is coming into a new project and this is something they know, I'm passionate about this. Are there any tips that you could give someone, whether it might be storage, dismantling the building, I don't know, with a builder in working with them, or anything that might be useful in their journey?
Yeah, I think collaboration is key, regardless of the focus of the project, to get the best out of everybody. If you are thinking of reusing a lot of materials, then storage is extremely useful because you can't just turn up on the day you want it and get the material that you are much more likely to be able to do with the standard product. So if you do have storage, then that makes life a lot easier. It can certainly add to the planning requirements for a project. And I don't mean planning as in the council planning department. I just mean planning in terms of choosing and storing your materials. But again, to a certain extent, that's where some of the architectural salvage yards come into play. They're not necessarily going to have exactly what you want on the date you want, but they're a great tool for choice. And sometimes they can store products for a period of time as well.
Is there anything else that you think we should be mentioning as part of this conversation?
I think something to add is that don't feel overwhelmed by reuse and recycling. It's something that once you get into it can be exciting and really fun, actually.
Yeah, I agree. But do you think you need an architecture firm like you who they buy into it? Because if you don't, I don't know what's going to happen.
Whoever you're working with needs to buy into it, whether that's your architect or your building contractor or anyone else in the process. Because if not, then like anything else, if you don't have the same ethos as the people that you're working with, it makes things a lot more difficult. It doesn't matter whether it's reuse of materials or anything else in the project. So I think that's really key. And it might be that the architect and the client find some amazing things together in terms of materials to reuse, but if you're working with the wrong contractor, then they're not going to be picking that up, or vice versa, whichever of those people in that process are not aligned to the project ethos, it does make it difficult. But when you get a great contractor to work with, or anybody else from the design team or the build team, then everyone putting their heads together to find solutions really can make the reused materials sing. And an example of that in the case of the seed actually is the timber bricks and the gabions, which is something we focused on partly for that reason.
We started off this conversation talking about Passive House, and I was saying we met on one of your early projects. Is there any area of sustainability that you feel is opening up before you, something that perhaps you might not have done in the past? It's quite difficult, isn't it? Sometimes I'm always nervous about letting go of, say, performance in favour of considering embodied carbon, or, it's a bit of a juggling act.
Oh, I suppose we don't see them as competing against one another.
Oh, well, that's good. Good. How?
So, so I think what's interesting now is more and more people are aware of embodied carbon or embodied energy as an issue in construction. And we've been working with Passive House now for about 14 or 15 years. So that's our go-to for lots of good reasons in terms of performance and social reasons. But actually, yeah, thinking about the impact of the construction in the same way that we've been able to look at the performance is a really powerful tool, because I think what's been interesting as the journey that we've gone through is now that we can quantify elements. So for a long time we were focusing on performance, and the decisions that you might make instinctively are often right, but they're not always. And it's exactly the same with embodied carbon and embodied energy. So the discussion that we already touched upon with the PV panels was something that perhaps surprised a lot of us in the industry. Made us prick up our ears and think a little bit more about what we were doing. And that's always good. It's always good to be challenged. It's good to not just be doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for the best, but actually to find out whether that is a good idea or not.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps where measuring more and checking and modelling and having all of the things connect backwards and forwards makes a lot more sense. I mean, how practical do you think the measurement side of things is, doing all these studies, or does it have to be only in these scenarios where the client's very passionate?
There's a lot of studies that can be done very quickly. And then also, as experience grows, both within any individual practice and in the industry, then these things happen much more quickly because the information is available. So if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, trying to find embodied carbon data or embodied energy data was extremely difficult. And we were looking for it and working with master's students who were developing elements of that. But it wasn't something that people were aware of. You speak to suppliers and they'd raise their eyebrows and hope to put the phone down. But now it's something that there is a lot more information about there. Of course, there's tools to relatively easily check this out. So in terms of performance, we would always use PHPP as a relatively quick modelling tool, regardless of whether the project meets Passive House or close to it. And that has a plugin which you can also look at embodied carbon or embodied energy rather as well. So some of these things can be done at relatively low cost, and so standard for the type of work that we would be doing.
Yeah, they also bring a lot of value too, don't they?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about those kind of tools is, for example, if you're using PHPP, so the modeling of the construction process, then you can choose whether you think that extra 50 millimeters of insulation is worth the cost or not. And that, there's a huge value to that. It puts the control for specification and budget firmly in the design team and client's pocket, which is fantastic.
Well, Kirsty, it's been lovely to catch up again. You stay well, and thank you very much.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Get more in our show notes, which you can find online today at houseplanninghelp.com/342, including some wonderful photos. I know Kirsty loves her photography, so that will be one element. But as a practice, it's so nice, isn't it, to have some really good photos to look back on the projects you produce. We've got our summary, so you can flick through the main points once again. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. Well, you can do that in one of two ways, either within the show notes or on social media. We'll give you links if you prefer the latter. And we'll link you to Kirsty's architectural practice. All of that at houseplanninghelp.com/342. My call to action is to check out the hub, and this is where we continue the learning. We just keep on going. We're trying to build up a library of useful digital assets so you can go through in your own time, particularly the visual side of things. This is a podcast. We're all about audio. We like to get visual, whether it's presentations, we have live trainings from various different guests, or perhaps it's our in-depth video case studies where we spend quite a long time. We follow entire projects all the way through. Then there's the courses as well, which is a very visual thing. and you can network with like-minded people in the forum. We've also got Ask the Expert. If you've got a particular question you want to get off your chest, or just have a chat with me. Every week I make myself available so that you can have a chat in office hour. Get all the details, the lowdown, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, Josh Wood from Green Trace Architect is my guest, and we're going to be looking at his own infill project, which is fascinating. There's a tight budget, so he's really getting his value for money on sweat equity, perhaps taking a little bit of risk, but hopefully calculated risk, and of course, trying to make the best eco choices that he can within budget. Oh yes, and there's a partner to bring along and convince this is all a good idea. I hope you can join me for that one. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.